So who would know that? Who would know? Prison guards that wanted him murdered,
sure.
I suppose, would know.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Tuesday, July 8th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and joining me are Real Clear Politics co-founder and president Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So guys, the Trump administration is getting a dose of its own medicine on the release of what they're calling the last word on Jeffrey Epstein. In a cabinet meeting today, Trump tried to discourage the press from asking any more questions about Epstein. It didn't really work that out too well for him. Tom, what do you make of how the White House is handling this?
It was really bizarre. You know, Stephen Nelson of the New York Post asked, they opened the cabinet meeting up to questions, and he asked him about this. So they just released this on Sunday night, saying basically the administration did, saying Jeffrey Epstein, like, case closed, right? There's no list, there's no videos, there's no nothing. He didn't, he wasn't murdered, and that's it. And so that raises a lot of questions, and people are like, wait a minute, what's going on? And Pam Bondi had said that she had the client list was like sitting on her desk apparently, and, just various things. And then Trump is like, he kind of interrupts and says, why are we talking about? People are still talking about this Jeffrey Epstein and that creep, years ago. What's going on? I mean, it was really weird the way that Trump sort of tried to get the press to, it's
Tom. It didn't work anyway.
It didn't work anyway.
Didn't take the cue.
Yeah, she didn't take the stage direction at all. She ended up answering the question. She's trying to, explain away her statements now. So, look, they've kind of botched the handling of this whole Jeffrey Epstein stuff. Remember, and we talked about this earlier on Megyn Kelly's show. I mean, there was this whole production that the White House did that Pam Bondi orchestrated, right? They gave these binders. They called in all these like social media influencers, biggest Trump supporters, gave them these binders full of Jeffrey Epstein stuff. They thought they were getting new, classified information, right? Which is what basically the administration promised. And all they got was sort of retread stuff that was already in the public domain. And so it was kind of a debacle. And they just can't seem to get around, now it looks like they're covering something up. And I just don't think they want this story to go away. But I think they've actually made it so that it won't go away. They're going to continue to be questions asked.
Yeah, this does seem to just keep raising more questions than answering it at this point. Carl, there is this, story about the tape too, the videotape of the cell. There's a 10 hours or 12 hours of tape showing the cell, and they should say, oh, no one came and went. And then it turns out there's a minute missing. It's a minute right before midnight. And Pam Bondi said today, well, that's standard operating procedure. We never tape the last minute before midnight, which just raises more questions about who knew that.
She said in that prison, there's this glitch every night is a minute, and they keep, she gave this incoherent thing. They keep reusing the same tape apparently. Right. And so every night there's a gap of 1 minute, and which doesn't show up on film. So who would know that? Who would know? Prison guards that wanted him murdered, I suppose, would know. Right. It was, if she had said nothing, it would have, what's that old line from Cool Hand Luke? Sometimes nothing's a pretty good hand. Trump gave her an out. It was a preposterous assertion that the president made that this is too old a story for you to talk about. It's, it's less than 48 hours in terms of this development, but she didn't, she wanted to talk about it, and she did. And so we talked about this with the three of us with Megyn Kelly, who thinks Pam Bondi is not long for this world as Trump's AG. I don't know, but I'll tell you this. We'll talk about this in the next segment, Andy, and I don't mean to preempt your very careful and superb and professional, moderation of this show and production of this show. But Elon Musk, when he was doing his flame war with Trump, said, the reason, and by the way, Trump's on the Jeffrey Epstein tapes or whatever, right? He's on the list, whatever. So now a conspiracy-minded person, left or right, MAGA or left-wing, thinks, okay, the two political parties are now conspiring to keep the secret. And client list is a strange nomenclature anyway. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't a real estate agent. He wasn't a lawyer. Pimps don't call the client. Maybe they do. I don't know. But now you think, okay, they're covering up both sides. So who could I vote for? Who could I finally get to the bottom of the Jeffrey Epstein suicide / maybe murder? I can vote for America's party. I can vote for Elon Musk, whoever Elon Musk puts up, and they won't be compromised like the Republicans and Democrats. And then we could finally get to the bottom of it.
So he's got 0.2% of a vote support.
Well, I don't know about that,
Tom. There may be more conspiracy buffs out there than you think.
I don't think it's fair to call this a conspiracy, nut kind of story. I think it's a very legitimate story, Tom. I would like to know.
See, there's one voter right there.
Right. Yeah. No, I would like to know more, and I find that this explanation completely unsatisfactory.
Look, I agree with that. And part of this is the expectations that Trump, and his folks set coming into office. Right. They were going to provide radical transparency on all this stuff on the Russia hoax. They were going to get to, dump all those files, MLK, JFK, all of that stuff. Right. Epstein was part of that.
After they solved the Ukraine war in one day.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of they're promising to basically inform the public, and they've botched it now. I mean, they've made it worse, and they look like they're covering up. Look, we ran this piece on RealClearPolitics this morning. Michael Schellenberger wrote it for his Substack, and Michael Schellenberger is not some, right-wing loon.
He's not even a left-wing loon.
And he's not a left-wing loon. Yeah. And he's basically said, look, they've botched this, and Congress should demand, and the administration should provide transparency on these files and put some of this stuff to rest. And so I agree with you. I think it's legitimate, but I mean, is it going to fuel Elon Musk's new America party? I don't think it's that big of an issue.
All right. Well, let's talk about Elon Musk. He, as you guys say, he's continued this bid to start this party. He's calling it the American Party. He talked with former Democratic candidate Andrew Yang about it, apparently. Yang tried to launch what he called the Forward Party back in 2021, Carl. So how seriously should we take this third-party bid? As you know, I love third parties. I think they're a fascinating part of American politics.
Well, that's right. And it's very difficult in American politics to have a third party. Nobody's quite sure why the political scientists, have their theories, and they look you right in the eye and tell you almost like it's a scientific impossibility. It's in the Bible. It's in the Constitution. It's none of those things. It's just a custom. When we get a third party, usually what happens, it's happened a couple of times only in 250 years, is one of the other party goes away. So the Republicans replace the Whigs. In a country, though, where you can get, 19 different colors of Ford Maverick, you can get any number of phones, you have 500 channels, you can get all this choice we have. You go to a grocery store, be paralyzed, but you get two political parties. It makes no sense, and everybody knows it. It's just that two political parties have put up these tremendous barriers to entry, ballot access, rigged campaign finance rules, and the media's bought into it. So it's hard, but it's not impossible. Ross Perot did it. He's formed the Reform Party in 1992. He got nearly 20% of the vote after he dropped out and flaked, wouldn't spend any money. He got 19% of the vote after he showed he was a little bit touched and just too eccentric to be president. It was a protest vote, in other words, and 1 out of 5 voters. So there's an appetite out there. It's just that it's very difficult to do. Our politics is personality driven. So, and Elon Musk can't run for president. He's foreign born. So you need a candidate, you need a platform, and you need a lot of money. But we talked to Greg Orman last week on this show, and Greg Orman says, it takes a person who's really a disruptive force, who's imaginative, who can see around corners, who does things nobody else can do. And then he says, and that's Elon Musk.
Yeah.
He fired rockets. Nobody said only NASA could do it. This guy does it. The internal combustion engine had been here. Electric cars predate the internal combustion engine. Nobody could ever figure out how to make them work, make money. This guy did it with Tesla. So maybe it's this kind of innovator who is really new to politics, and maybe that's what it takes, Andy, is somebody who's just a fresh look.
Well, Tom, I buy all that, and I think Carl makes a good point that he's got money, he's famous, and he owns Twitter, or X. So he's got a lot going for him. But what are the sort of ideas that would sort of motivate this? Because if you look at Ross Perot, he had a set of ideas that really changed the way American politics works. I mean, he was the guy who sort of talked about the big sucking sound from NAFTA, and so he put trade on the agenda. Education was a big thing for him, and the deficit and the debt. So he had three big issues that Americans really cared about at that time.
Elon's got one of those, the debt.
The debt, yeah. So, but is that enough?
I don't. And look, part of the problem is, and Carl mentioned, he can't run. He can't be the candidate. And that's part of the problem. I mean, you can provide a framework, but you got to have a charismatic leader who builds a movement and is able to develop this groundswell based on a coherent set of ideas. Is the debt and deficit, could that be the center of a movement? Sure, it could be. But who's going to lead it? It's not going to be Elon. He can help. He can, spend a lot of money to promote someone. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's got to be the person. Ross Perot is a compelling individual, eccentric, of course. And, Carl's description was very generous. He flaked. I mean, the guy was a nut. Right. He kind of flaked out a little bit and lost his momentum but still managed to get 19% of the vote, which is a tremendous showing in the current environment. So, and they've tried, there've been these things. We had Americans elect, I don't know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago now, something like that, where they, these folks got together and put up it was like $80 million or something. Right. And they had this American Idol, people would pick their favorite candidate and they'd have the run, whatever. And it didn't work. You can't impose it from the top down. It's got to come from the ground up, and it's got to come from a charismatic leader who people will follow and will follow that message. And so, I keep waiting for these third parties to, materialize. We've had, no labels. We've had all sorts of things that have been happening, trying to take advantage of the fact that our society continues to polarize and become so tribal that you would think it would provide an opportunity for, a sane centrist, person to come, drive down the middle. But counterintuitively, I think there's less room than ever because it's red team, blue team. And nobody has been compelling enough to want to join the green team or whatever other, color we're going to choose for that.
Right. Purple.
So
purple.
No, red. No, Elon's already addressed that. Red, white, and blue.
Red, white, and blue party. Great. Trump could have dismissed it, and I kind of agree with him. He said, look, he can have fun with it, but it ain't going anywhere. And that's kind of how I feel about it.
All right. Well, we're going to keep an eye on it. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon, and we'll be back with more right after these words. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. And guys, last week, the CIA issued this declassified memo criticizing the intelligence agencies for their work around the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Tom, what did we learn from this memo? There was this great divergence on the press coverage of this, which I love. Miranda Devine of the New York Post called it a bombshell. Reuters described it this way: CIA review finds flaws, but does not dispute finding Putin sought to sway 2016 vote to Trump.
Yeah, well, what would you expect from Reuters? Or any of the
lobbed him a real fat softball pitch there.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things that we learned, a couple of things we learned. One, and this was the subject of Miranda Devine's column, which was that John Brennan, head of the CIA
director,
CIA director under Obama, perjured himself before Congress. He said under oath that the Steele dossier was not used in any way, shape, or form to inform the intelligence community's assessment. That turned out to be not true. According to this report, John Brennan demanded that the Steele dossier be included in the intel assessment report over the objections of some of his deputies who said it didn't meet the basic standards of statecraft. So we learned that. And we also learned that, I think Barack Obama, and this is another piece, this is Margot Cleveland at the Federalist, pointed out that, look, Barack Obama was deeply involved in this. I mean, he was the one who sort of, was responsible for pushing this thing sort of out the door and getting the ball rolling. And his, James Clapper, John Brennan, and others sort of went to work on this. And I just think this entire episode, the more we learn about it in hindsight and after the fact, the more dastardly it seems. It's one of the great, I think, political, dirty tricks that have ever been performed in American politics. I mean, the idea, this thing that to hamstring Donald Trump before he even got into office, and to undermine him and his administration, members of his cabinet. Michael Flynn gets entrapped by James Comey, who's another one that was involved in this entire thing. And we've talked about him and his participation in this before. This is one of the worst dirty tricks of all time, and nobody's really been held accountable for it. I mean, James Clapper and John Brennan are still on CNN getting paid and opining.
What's the statute of limitations on perjury?
I think it's actually coming up. Someone had said that, and I don't know if this is true, but someone responded to a post that I did on this the other day on X saying it's running out soon, which may be true.
Yeah. Carl, Miranda Devine, who's a friend of the show and is on occasionally, she did an interview with Ratcliffe, and Ratcliffe told her, this is an interesting quote. This is Ratcliffe, who was the current CIA director. This was Obama, Comey, Clapper, and Brennan deciding, quote, we're going to screw Trump. That's pretty bold statement, don't you think?
Well, that's kind of what it seems, though. You don't want to go. You don't necessarily want to go there, but that's where the evidence seems to lead. Andy, we've been talking the last couple of days about Mamdani, the mayor in waiting in New York City, and he's not just a culture warrior and pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, and woke. He's also kind of an old line Marxist Leninist. He cites these old shibboleths from Das Kapital,
right.
and
grabbing the means of production, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And but it reminds me that John Brennan voted for Gus Hall when he was a young man, and I don't want to go.
It's astonishing that a guy who voted for the communists, became our CIA director.
I think so too. And it reminds me of those stories that used to read when Thomas is a little before your time, when Andy and I were kids, in the 60s and 70s. You'd see these stories would come up from the British press, and it would be, St. John St. Smythe turns out to be a Soviet agent.
Wait, now
some British
you're not
guy,
really going there, are you?
Some British guy with Brennan? Yeah, why not? I mean, he voted for Gus Hall, and then he comes up with this theory that involves Russia and the United States. I don't know. It seems he's probably just a Democrat.
He's lied to Congress repeatedly.
He's probably just a Democratic Party hack. He's so partisan he doesn't even think he's lying. But the mind boggles.
Well, Tom, this some other news today. This is a federal judge. Actually, it happened yesterday. Temporarily blocked the Trump administration from borrowing Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. Now, this was supposed to happen as part of Trump's big, beautiful bill. The law was supposed to ban Medicaid funding for health groups that, quote, primarily are engaged in family planning services, including abortions, for a year. The judge turned that back for 2 weeks. I thought after the Supreme Court we weren't going to have any more universal injunctions, but this feels...
Didn't we decide this?
this feels pretty universal and pretty junction-y.
Andy, are you saying the Party of Democracy doesn't believe that Congress should appropriate money and that the Supreme Court decisions aren't valid?
Well, this is a judge in Massachusetts, but she stayed this for 2 weeks. I mean, the ink is just dry on the big, beautiful bill. This is the first thing that they've done to sort of counter something in it. What do you make of it?
I mean, this is not an executive order issued by the president. This is a bill that passed both houses of Congress and was signed by the president. So, look, we'll have to see. I used to be shocked by this kind of stuff, but I'm not anymore. There are certainly we've seen too many examples of judges and folks sort of getting outside of their lanes and doing all these things. The ends justify the means. It's all just
wait a minute. Wait, guys. Let's not go off too far down that road. This is a bill signed into law. It's a tax bill, right? But if it prohibits things in Medicaid that are required in other legislation for Medicaid to do, it is up to the courts to sort it out. And I don't think we ought to assume that this judge is already throwing out the baby with the bathwater and doing extrajudicial things. This is brought to her. She's looked at it. She stayed it for a couple of weeks. I don't think we ought to. Let's not go too far.
The judge from Massachusetts.
Yes, sir.
Who appointed this judge?
Well, last I checked, Massachusetts is a state in good standing in the United States of America,
okay.
Tom.
All right.
Well, but Carl, the argument is, as I take it, that Planned Parenthood is making is that they've been singled out in this bill, even though they're not named by name in the bill. It's a First Amendment issue because they are being singled out for their speech, I guess, about abortion, and that is why they're arguing now. That we don't know if the judge bought the argument or not, but that is the argument that they're making, at least in public, about why they should their funding should continue.
I'm the
So
first
it's about
to
them talking about abortions instead of actually performing abortions.
Well, that's a stretch, but let's just see where this litigation goes.
That seems, yeah.
Well, we'll see. Anyway,
I'm no lawyer, Carl, but that doesn't seem very.
It's an imaginative argument.
All right. Well, it's another case we'll follow. But you're right, Carl. It's just a 2-week decision. We'll find out what happens after that. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl, but don't go away. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Charles Lipson. He is the Peter B. Ritzma Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago, frequent contributor to not only Real Clear Politics, but Spectator World and a bunch of others. And you can find all of his writings at, was it charleslipson.com? Is that?
You were wise beyond your years.
There we go. All right. Charles, good to have you back on the show. I wanted to talk to you about this. I came across these clips of, apparently there's a Socialism 2025 conference that is going on. And there's an account online that was watching this and clipping some of the remarks from it. And one of the remarks that caught my attention for obvious reasons is it was a Princeton professor, and it got forwarded to me because I'm a Princeton alum. And
many people from Princeton go on to live rewarding lives, Tom. Don't let it get you down.
Well, this professor, Lorgia Garcia Pena, who was actually was at Harvard for a number of years and was denied tenure. It was kind of a big story 4 or 5 years ago. Ends up at Princeton, and she's, at this conference and basically talking about, screw the universities. And I want to, I'm trying to activate and we're trying to organize. I've got all this, access to kids. It was kind of shocking. And then I came across another clip from Iman Abadabi, who is a professor at your school, the University of Chicago, which also basically said, F the University of Chicago, this capitalist structure, all this stuff. And Charles, I just want to get your take on this. And A, were you shocked by any of this? And also give us a sense of, what this is, what's going on at these universities, how these people, these professors are hired by these universities who explicitly state this is not some secretive thing, that they want to dismantle the very institution that's paying their salaries.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of discussion about this among Chicago faculty who are part of a small listserv, and sadly it's small, called the Free Speech Listserv. And what would strike you, Tom, and what would strike your viewers is how there's almost no support for firing such a person. This is free speech unless he or she threatens somebody specifically or grades students in a way that is clearly biased, then this person shouldn't be fired. On the other hand, so this is not IBM or RCP. You can determine your own employees, but the real just as people are voting with their feet, leaving Illinois, leaving California for the first time since the gold rush, leaving New York, and going to states that are fostering economic growth and are vibrant, the same is true for students. These departments, you're not going to see many people like this in microbiology. You're not going to see them very often in economics. Most economics department, to the surprise of most listeners, are actually liberal, but they're not crazy. And students are just no longer majoring in all of these very narrow, ideologically suffused fields. When you and I were in college, and I was in college before you, there were a lot of students who just majored in English or history, not because they wanted to become an English professor. What'd you major in?
American history.
Right. Not because you wanted to become a historian necessarily, but because scholars like Sean Wilentz or whoever was at Princeton at the time.
James McPherson, who was a great historian of the Civil War era. Mm-hmm. These people were great, and it was fun to study with them. That's just no longer the case. Historians are all about how awful America is. English professors are all about anti-colonialism. People who major in English want to read Jane Austen. They don't want to hear about a colonial oppression. That's not wrong to talk about that, but these fields students have been forced out of them. And what you're seeing is that the fields themselves now hire people. It's not just that they hire awful people like the ones you're talking about. If you declared yourself to be pro-Israel, for God's sake, you would never get tenure in these departments. You would never get tenure at Harvard Divinity School, which is now a hot, a cesspool of anti-Semitism. These places have become awful, and American taxpayers are getting tired of funding them. Charles, I sent this around to some fellow Princeton folks, and one of them said that this is not really representative of even those departments. And certainly not of the schools you mentioned. Like there's the whole science department, which a lot of those folks, they're not involved in, basically what comes down to and what came through to me from these clips is it's not even teaching. It's indoctrination. It's activism.
That's right.
This is not, we're trying to show two viewpoints or whatever. But I guess the response was, well, even within these departments, these people are a minority. And I wonder, was that your experience at the University of Chicago, or are these departments, the humanities, the ones that are doing, the radical transgenderism or feminism or whatever the, discipline is, colonialism, that kind of stuff, have they been completely captured? I mean, is it 80% of the department? Is it 20% of the department? Can you give us a sense of what that might be?
Well, I think you want to, besides dividing these universities by field, I think you all also want to ask whether or not a group is dominant in the department, as they are in some, or whether they have veto power over appointments in some others. Take Middle Eastern studies, which are a cesspool all over the country, right? All of the people who are just hate Israel were all hired by the first generation of Middle Eastern scholars who were largely Jewish, pro-Israel, but liberal in the old-fashioned sense. They wanted different views. People like Rashid Khalidi, who was both a classmate of mine in college and then a colleague at the University of Chicago, though he was in Middle Eastern studies. He was hired by a guy named Lenny Binder and other people. Lenny had been in the 1948 war in Israel. But then there's no way that a guy like Rashid Khalidi would ever hire Lenny Binder. So it's like those lobster traps that they put out in Maine where the lobster can crawl in, but there's no way to crawl out. And they let lobsters crawl in, but then they themselves would never be allowed in. So I think it's a real problem. I think what's actually going to happen in many of these universities is that besides the general pressure on the university financially, because of a variety of different things, not just Trump, but the fact that students are, who would you rather hire? A physics major from Mississippi State or a gender studies major from Harvard? Well, who's the smarter one, frankly? If it's a general knowledge, the physics major. All you know about the gender studies major is that she was admitted to Harvard. You don't know anything about whether she could pass courses that were rigorous there. In fact, Harvard now has a remedial math course, if you can believe it. And I'm surprised if Princeton and Yale and Columbia don't too. But these schools have lost their way. And the best way I can tell you to measure that is to ask yourself if the number two person, called the provost in many universities, the provost is always looking to become president of another university. Right? So you're provost at Princeton, you'd like to become president at Harvard or Columbia or whatever. And ask yourself, does the provost at Princeton is more likely or less likely to get that job if she cracks down on some of the people who are going way over the top on some of these things? And the answer is less likely, not more likely. And that's institutional corruption. And that's the problem. What's likely to happen is that these bad departments are likely to shrink, not because of ideological opposition to them, but because the dogs won't eat the dog food. The students won't go into majors like you did in American history if all they're going to get, starting actually now in junior high school, is being beat over the head with how awful America is.
Do you think we've got just about a minute left, Charles? I mean, can the universities recover, or is the system just completely going to fall of its own weight?
It's an open question. Because universities are facing financial pressure, both from the federal government and from their donors. I mean, would your classmates from Princeton be likely to just give a general professorship at Princeton in American history, like you studied, knowing what Princeton is likely to do with it? I think that there's a lot of pressure. By the way, parents are also putting pressure. There's more and more students who would rather go to a good university in the South where there's just not going to be all this nonsense.
Yeah. All right. We've got to leave it there. Charles Lipson, the Peter B. Ritzma Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago. Check out all of his writings at charleslipson.com. Charles, thanks for joining me. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. As long as your listeners remember that emeritus means great with merit.
Very good. All right. We're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined now by John Tamny. He is the editor of RealClearMarkets, which you can find at RealClearMarkets.com. John, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So you have a piece ran yesterday in Real Clear Markets, and the headline is, "Say it routinely, the Fed isn't, nor can it ever be, independent." And you write in part this, you say, the Fed is an outsourced creation of Congress whose officials are appointed by presidents and confirmed by Congress. Of course, it's political and the opposite of independent. So explain that, because one of the big complaints about Trump right now is that he wants to bend the current Fed chairman to his will and get him to lower interest rates. So who's independent here and who's in control?
Well, the very notion that the Fed's in control is laughable. Fed officials are appointed by politicians. To presume that they didn't politic to be in that position in the first place to presume that they don't bend the wishes of presidents in the first place to please them, to basically, I know that they theoretically can't get fired, but that they don't bend to the wishes of politicians is laughable. This is a politically appointed entity. It's not necessary. I don't say that as a conspiracy theory. I just say that you don't need the Fed to regulate banks. You don't need the Fed to liquefy solvent banks. You certainly don't need the Fed to set interest rates. I mean, since when do Republicans think that a government entity can set an interest rate in the first place? At which point it's superfluous, which means it's by its very definition, its description, a politicized institution.
But I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Are you saying that the Fed doesn't have the power to set interest rates, or that the Fed chairman doesn't or listens to politicians? Why are we having this fight then?
Because politicians believe, and so do a lot of economists believe, that the Fed can set interest rates, which is laughable. The Fed is an interest rate follower. If the Fed could set interest rates, the US economy would be too weak to even talk about, and we wouldn't be having this discussion because we'd be working in desperation just to feed our families. I mean, let's never forget the price of credit is the most important price in the world, other than possibly the dollar. And so this notion that the Fed is setting its cost, please, I mean, everyone's got a different interest rate. If you go to a bank today, your borrowing experience will be exponentially different from mine, from Jeff Bezos's, from name your person, because everyone's got a different income. Everyone's got a different situation. And so the idea that the Fed can decree the cost of something that's so important is just not serious.
But the Fed is setting the interbank interest rate. Is that, I mean, they're setting a rate, right? And you're not saying that they're not setting a rate.
Is it? The idea that banks would need the Fed to set a rate for the overnight lending, it's just not serious. And again, I don't say this as a conspiracy theorist. My view has always been that both sides vastly overstate the importance and power of the Fed. I'm just saying this as the idea that the Fed would need, or the banks would need the Fed to do that, or that the Fed has some major power to do that. Interest rates are set in the marketplace, and evidence supporting this claim is just travel back in time to when credit was allegedly costless. Remember when we were at zero all that time?
Right.
Well, so why then, when we were at zero, was Elon Musk literally talking about asking his wife's family at the time to borrow against their house because all of his businesses were running out of money? If credit was costless, couldn't he have just gone and gotten it for no price from banks? In reality, there was not an interest rate high enough for an Elon Musk to get equity credit, let alone lending credit, for much of the 2010s. That describes most businesses. Most businesses can't borrow at all, so they have to give up big portions of their in terms of equity in order to get any kind of capital at all. And so I just think this focus on the Fed is kind of odd.
And so how do you explain the sort of White House's sort of focus on getting the Fed chair to lower interest rates? What explains the sort of fascination there?
Well, the people I've talked to are close to Trump. They say that Trump says, well, I like low interest rates, except for he hasn't had a low interest rate in years. I mean, and we know that. And how we know that is that banks, when he was a private citizen, had largely shut their doors to him. Deutsche Bank was the only one. Other major banks were no longer lending to him because he was no longer a credit risk. And so I think with Trump, there's a little bit of showmanship, precisely because media, left and right, still focus on the Fed as though what it does actually moves the cost of credit. I think he wants to be seen as the person decreeing lower credit costs, but let's just agree that it's much easier said than done. I mean, let's look at the most dynamic sector of the U.S. economy today. Most would agree it's Silicon Valley. Yet there's no startup out there that borrows money. And there isn't, because there's no interest rate high enough for those startups to be loaned to at. And the reason for that is just about every startup in Silicon Valley fails. And so here we have not just the most dynamic sector of the U.S. economy, but a sector of the U.S. economy that quite literally drives the global economy. If you took Silicon Valley out of it, the global economy would be exponentially smaller. Yet they don't. Do you think they follow the Fed? Why
Right.
would they?
But
There's
what about
nothing that the
mortgage
Fed does
rates?
that
What
can
about
affect what
credit card
happens to them.
rates? I mean, those are the things we are told are sort of tied to the Fed's decisions. Is that true or not?
Oh gosh, I mean, what's your rate? What's mine when I run up a tab at Visa or
Well,
American
I
Express?
know that if I went to my bank and refinanced rates, my home mortgage right now, I would pay a higher rate than I got, say, when I did it, which was 10, 15 years ago, I guess.
No, and no doubt that's true, but why is it true? Is that because banks are basically following the Fed, or is Fed following banks?
Mm,
Certainly, when you look at when rates were lower in the 2000s from banks and people were borrowing fairly cheaply to buy houses, largely what that was banks just rushing away from risk. I mean, it's
hmm
easy to forget that housing is kind of a safe loan. And the reason for that is there's a recoverable asset if people stop paying it. And
Right,
so interest rates on housing are always going to be low because it's non-risky. Whereas if you lend to an individual or you lend to a business, the
right,
individual could disappear. The individual could
right.
walk it. The individual could die. Same with the business, and there's nothing to get back. And so I think a lot of this it speaks to what's true. The economy is much better than it was in the 2000s. And so banks are taking bigger risks. And because they are, they're not so willing to lend as cheaply to housing.
Huh. Okay, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm talking to John Tamny. He's the editor of Real Clear Markets. So what do you think is the proper role for the Fed, or do we even need a Fed? From your point of view, it sounds like maybe we don't even need one.
Well, no, we don't. Let's be clear. And again, I don't say this as some wild-eyed Austrian school person who thinks the Fed is the source of all of our economic ills. Again, the books I've written about the Fed make a case that it's just not that important one way or the other. Do we need it? Of course not. And how you know we don't need it is that any bank that runs into near-term credit difficulties, as in it's solvent, but it needs cash in the near term, it would never go to the Fed.
Uh-huh.
And the reason it would never go to the Fed is because to go to the Fed for a loan is a signal that voluminous market-based sources of credit passed on you. So for a bank to go to the Fed for a loan is for a bank to admit that it's bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why banks avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that can be hidden. And so you don't need the Fed exists. It's an outsourced creation of Congress, not to prop up solvent banks. Markets already do that. The Fed exists. It's an outsourced creation of Congress precisely to prop up insolvent banks. So the Fed leans against the market's message. I don't think that's a good thing. The Fed regulates banks, but well, we know from 2008 that it's not a very good regulator of banks. It couldn't see into the future, which we shouldn't expect it to. And so you'd rather private lenders essentially regulate banks, watch over them than the Federal Reserve. It's just a bunch of economists. At which point the Fed, as we've discussed, presumes to set some kind of overnight market lending rate. But I mean, honestly, do we really think banks need the Fed for this? I mean, just hopefully the question answers itself. Banks don't need the Fed for this. And so the Fed, of course, it's superfluous and it keeps looking for a purpose, as all bureaucracies do, because it's the biggest employer of economists in the world. It's got a huge base of employees that, well, they need jobs, and so they're always looking for things. But no, we don't need the Fed.
So in a perfect world, John, we got about a minute left here. In John Tamny's perfect world, does the Fed go away? Does it shrink to a small enough that it be put in the bathtub, or uh, what's your view of what's your
Oh, in
perfect
my
Fed?
perfect world, the Fed would disappear because it serves no purpose. But that's never going to happen. And it's never
Mhm.
going to happen because it's a full employment act for economists. It's also a way for Congress to basically outsource the dirty stuff about bailing out banks that markets no longer would prefer to go under in the first place. And
Mhm.
so you're never going to get rid of the Fed. What I do think will change over time is that gradually people will become wise to the truth that, again, if the Fed were a fraction of as powerful as people assume in terms of its ability to set the cost of credit, we'd be in a world of economic trouble. And we know this because central planning fails always and everywhere. I mean, the surest sign that the Fed's not that important when it comes to credit costs is the abundant nature of the U.S. economy. So the Fed will always be with us. I just think both sides overstate its import. It's just not that big of a deal.
Wow. Well, okay, great stuff. I've been talking to John Tamny. He is the editor of Real Clear Markets. You can find his latest article as well as a bunch of other good stuff at RealClearMarkets.com. So check it out. I'm Andrew Walworth. That's our program for today. Thank you for listening. We'll be back here with more Real Clear Politics tomorrow. Have a great evening.